The message arrived at 4:12 Coordinated Station Time, and it was 11 words long. Ambassador Vas Kathrani read it twice before he understood it was not a drill, not a test of the new relay hardware, and not a joke in poor taste from an overworked human aide. It appeared on his terminal exactly as it had appeared on every terminal in every council office across 4,000 member systems, addressed to no one and everyone at once. Diplomatic relations are suspended, effective immediately. Earth delegation. Kathrani was Tsalu, a species whose skin changed color with mood, whether they wanted it to or not. And in the sourceless white light of his office, he watched his own forearms shift from a calm dove gray to a blotchy, anxious ochre. He had spent 19 years as the Tsalu liaison to the human delegation. He had eaten at Ambassador Reyes's table. He had held her granddaughter, once at a reception, while Reyes negotiated a fishing rights dispute between two moons that hated each other for reasons neither remembered. He called her direct line. It rang 4 times and connected to a recording that was not a recording at all. It was a single human voice, flat and unhurried, reciting the same 11 words back to him, and then nothing. He called the embassy switchboard. Same message. He called the council's own crisis line, the one meant for exactly this kind of event, and reached a foreign logistics officer named Dash who sounded like he hadn't slept. Every embassy, Dash said. Every consulate, every trade office, every cultural attaché post. 211 human diplomatic stations across council space. All dark in the same 40-second window. We have camera footage from 6 of them. I'll send you one. The footage, when it came through, showed an unremarkable human woman in her 50s standing up from her desk at the Vantris Trade Annex, closing her terminal, picking up a framed photograph, and walking out through a door that had not opened for a non-credentialed visitor in 11 years. She did not look rushed. She did not look upset. She looked like someone leaving work 5 minutes early to beat traffic. Behind her, the office light stayed on. The tea in her cup was still steaming when the recording ended. Kathrani sat very still and watched his arms turn a color he did not have a name for, because in 19 years of Tsalu diplomatic service, he had never needed one. By 6 o'clock, the council's emergency session had been called, which had happened 4 times in recorded galactic history. Once for the Vrel collapse, once for the Ashkandal plague, once when the Korati tried to annex a shipping lane by simply declaring it theirs on a Tuesday. And now for this, for a species that hadn't fired a shot, hadn't issued a demand, hadn't so much as raised its voice, and had somehow managed to make 4,000 systems worth of career diplomats feel, for the first time in living memory, that the floor might not be where they'd left it. The session opened with the speaker, a Andrahai elder named Felice Kaur, asking the only question that mattered and getting no answer that satisfied anyone. What, she said, do the humans want? Nobody knew. That was the problem. Every crisis the council had ever managed had come with terms attached, a grievance, a demand, a price. This one had come with a closed door and a cup of cooling tea, and the silence behind it was already starting to feel less like an absence and more like a verdict. 3 days changed nothing, which was itself the first real evidence that something had changed enormously. The council convened a working group. The Andrahai called it the Terran Contingency Committee, though nobody thought contingency was the right word for something with no visible cause, and staffed it with the 7 species who had the deepest institutional relationships with Earth. Kathrani sat on it, still faintly ochre around the wrists. Beside him sat Raul Ptu, a Farron economist whose entire career had been built on human shipping contracts, and, across the table, a Sevrai jurist named Imo Cade who had spent 4 decades translating human legal philosophy into something the rest of the galaxy could use in court. We start with the obvious, Cade said, in the clipped, unhurried cadence Sevrai used when they wanted a room to notice they weren't panicking. Someone provoked this. Find the provocation, address it, relations resume. This is how every prior withdrawal in council history has worked. There have been no prior withdrawals in council history, PTU said. There have been threats of withdrawal. There have been formal protests, boycotts of specific sessions. One memorable walkout by the Korati delegation over seating arrangements. There has never been a full, simultaneous, silent shutdown of an entire species' diplomatic infrastructure. We don't have a precedent. We have an absence of one. Then we build a working theory, Kate said, and we test it. What changed in the last standard year that touches humanity specifically? They built a list. It took 4 hours and covered a wall. Humanity had been denied full voting membership on the Trade Council 11 years running, on the grounds, never stated aloud, though everyone in the room had heard it stated in private, that a species barely 2 centuries out from its homeworld's own political unification hadn't yet demonstrated the temperamental stability required for a permanent seat. Human peacekeeping missions, requested constantly and granted no formal compensation structure, had been folded for a decade into a vague category called voluntary humanitarian contribution, which meant Earth's mediators worked the galaxy's ugliest conflicts, the Thren border wars, the Aal-Kest succession crisis, 6 separate famine relief operations on worlds that weren't even Council members, for travel expenses and the Council's thanks. 3 trade routes humanity had petitioned to open, each one already surveyed and paid for at human expense, sat unapproved in committee. The applications quietly refiled at the bottom of the queue every session for reasons that were, on paper, procedural. None of it individually looked like a reason to burn 2 centuries of relationship to the ground without a phone call. It doesn't have to be one thing, said a young Andrahai aide near the back of the room, and then looked immediately as though she regretted speaking. Go on, Kor said. My grandmother used to talk about her sister, the aide said. They didn't fight. There wasn't a day where something happened. One day her sister stopped calling. And when my grandmother finally asked why, her sister said, I told you 11 times. You just weren't the one who had to remember it. The room was quiet for a moment that felt much longer than it was. We are not sisters, Kate said finally. We are trading partners with a formal charter. Sentiment is not a diplomatic category. But Kathrani, still faintly ochre, found himself thinking about Ambassador Reyes at the reception with her granddaughter on her hip, laughing at something he'd said about Sala wedding customs, and thinking that maybe sentiment had been doing more of the Council's diplomatic work than anyone in this room had ever bothered to notice, right up until it stopped. The scouts went out in the second week, because the working group had run out of theories and the Council had run out of patience, and because 3 separate species had quietly decided that if nobody else was going to find out what was happening on Earth, they would go look for themselves. The karate went first and loudest, because the karate did everything loudly. A single unmarked cruiser broke from a supply convoy near the outer relay and burned hard for Sol, running dark, its captain apparently under the impression that a covert approach to a species that had just demonstrated it could coordinate a simultaneous continent-spanning shutdown without anyone noticing the planning phase was a good idea. Earth's orbital traffic control pinged the cruiser politely at the edge of the system, asked it to identify itself, received no response, and then, without hostility, without weapons, without so much as raising its voice, in the metaphorical sense that traffic control systems can be said to have a voice, rerouted 11,000 tons of automated debris collection drones into a slow, deliberate, mathematically elegant blockade around the ship. Not an attack. A parking ticket, scaled up until it became a wall. The cruiser sat there for 6 hours, unable to move without ramming civilian hardware, its captain broadcasting increasingly formal demands for release into a silence that never once dignified them with a reply. Then, without warning, the drones peeled away exactly as precisely as they'd assembled, and a single text message arrived on the cruiser's public channel. Next time, ask. The karate captain filed an 11-page grievance with the Council. Nobody could quite explain to him why the room he filed it in was trying very hard not to laugh. The second scouting attempt was quieter, and it was the one that mattered. A Sevri research vessel, credentialed, transparent, running every beacon it had, requested and received permission to enter Sol system for what it called atmospheric survey purposes, which everyone involved understood to be a face-saving fiction. Earth let it through without comment. Let it dock at a civilian orbital platform without comment. Let its crew disembark, take a shuttle down to a mid-sized coastal city, and walk around for 3 days without comment, escort, surveillance, or interference of any visible kind. What they found was not a species in crisis. They found farmers' markets. They found a symphony rehearsing something loud and joyful in a public square. They found children arguing about a sport the HFY officer couldn't follow the rules of, no matter how many times a patient stranger tried to explain them. They found on the third day a small government office with a line out the door, where they finally worked up the nerve to ask a local clerk, an ordinary woman in her 30s, drinking coffee from a chipped mug, whether she'd heard about the diplomatic suspension. "Oh, that," she said. "Yeah, everybody knows about that. Do you know why it happened?" She considered the question the way a person considers something they've thought about before, but never had to say out loud. "I think," she said slowly, "we just got tired of being useful and never being counted." She shrugged, not unkindly. "That's not an official statement or anything. Just what it feels like from down here." The HFY officer asked if she was worried about the council's reaction, about retaliation, about the economic consequences of losing every trade agreement Earth had painstakingly built. The woman thought about that too, and then smiled in a way the officer's report would later struggle to translate into any HFY emotional register. "Not really," she said. "We've been through worse without anybody's permission." While the HFY officer was still 3 days from filing her report, the silence had already found its first casualty, and it happened on a moon nobody in the council chamber could have located on a star chart without help. Al Kest had been quiet for 11 years, which in the history of Al Kest counted as a minor miracle. 2 clans, the Faroin and the Dusk Hollow, had spent 6 generations trading control of a single mineral-rich ridge back and forth through wars that killed thousands and settled nothing, until a human mediator named Priya Nakamura had spent 4 years of her life, unpaid beyond expenses, filed under voluntary humanitarian contribution, building a water-sharing agreement so patient and so specific that both clans had, almost against their own instincts, kept it. Nakamura had been recalled with everyone else in the same 40-second window. Nobody had replaced her, because nobody else had the standing, the trust, or the years of accumulated goodwill to replace her, and the council's own mediation office, thin, underfunded, better at drafting language than at sitting across a table from people who hated each other, had exactly one representative it could spare, a well-meaning Farron Jr. officer named Bassick, who arrived on Al Kest 9 days into the crisis with a briefing packet and no idea that the Dusk Hollow elder he was, meeting with had buried a brother in the last war over that ridge. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. It ended with the Faroin delegation walking out over a translation error so small that Nakamura would have caught it and smoothed it over without either side noticing, and Bassick simply hadn't known to listen for. 6 days later, the Faroin moved equipment onto the disputed ridge for the first time in over a decade. The Dusk Hollow responded in kind. By the time the news reached the council chamber, buried in a routine regional security bulletin that almost nobody read past the header, both sides had exchanged the kind of warning fire that in Al Kest's long, bloody history had never once stayed a warning for more than a week. It was Raul PTU cross-referencing shipping manifests for an unrelated report, who noticed the bulletin and understood what it meant before anyone else did, because he was the one person in the building who'd have known to ask who used to handle Al Kest. "This is what it looks like," he told the working group, sliding the bulletin across the table with a hand that wasn't quite steady, when the invisible thing stops being invisible. Nobody planned for a war on Al Kest. Nobody had to. We just always assumed someone was there holding it together, and it turns out the someone was one specific person working for free, and we let her walk out the door without ever telling her we knew what she was worth. The working group sent Bassick back with a second officer and a formal urgent, entirely too late request for the Dusk Hollow elder's patience. It took another 11 days and the personal intervention of the HFY Juriscade, calling in favors from a species he'd never worked with before, to get both clans back to a ceasefire that was, everyone in the room privately agreed, considerably worse than the one Nakamura had built and might not hold past the next dry season. It was the first time the report on the wall stopped being an abstraction. Somewhere on a moon most of the council had never visited, a war that had been sleeping for 11 years had woken up within 3 weeks of the one person keeping it asleep being told, quietly and without ceremony, that her work had never quite counted enough to be worth paying for. The report reached the council on the 9th day, And it did more damage to the working group's confidence than the karate standoff had, because it contained no threat to react to. A species preparing for war fortifies. A species preparing to negotiate from strength postures. What the HFY officer described, farmers' markets, symphonies, a clerk with a chipped coffee mug and nothing to prove, was a species that had simply, calmly, stopped needing the council's attention. "They're not punishing us," PTU said, staring at the report like it had personally wronged him. "Punishment requires an audience. This isn't for us. This is for them." "Which is worse," Kate said quietly. And for the first time in the 6 sessions Kathrani had sat across from him, the HFY jurist did not sound entirely composed. It was Kathrani who finally asked the question the whole committee had been circling without landing on. "What exactly," he said, "have we been asking of them? Not what we've given them credit for. What we've actually, materially, asked them to do, and what we've given back." Nobody in the room had the figures memorized, which was itself an answer. And it took the council's own archive division 4 full days to assemble them, because the requests had never been centrally logged. They'd gone out mission by mission, crisis by crisis, each one small enough on its own to seem reasonable. None of them ever added up in one place until now. The final tally, when it came, filled 30 pages, and Kathrani read every one of them twice. In the last decade alone, human mediators had been dispatched to 61 active conflicts, 11 of which involved species that were not even council signatories, and had no formal claim on council resources. Human logistics networks, quietly, almost invisibly, because nobody had ever thought to ask who was actually running the supply chains that kept remote outposts fed, moved an estimated 14% of all interstellar humanitarian aid tonnage, more than any 3 other species combined, for a fee structure that hadn't been renegotiated in over 20 years, even as fuel and crew costs across the council had roughly doubled. Earth had submitted and had rejected 17 separate trade route applications, each rejection filed as pending further review and never actually reviewed. Full council voting membership, requested formally 6 times, had been tabled 6 times, most recently on a technicality about ratification timelines that 3 separate HFY legal scholars, reviewing the record now with fresh eyes, agreed had been applied nowhere else in council history. "We didn't declare war on them," PTU said, very quietly, looking at the last page. "We just never got around to noticing them as anything but useful." Core, at the head of the table, said nothing for a long moment. "Then, convene a full session. Not the working group. The full council. I want every delegate in that chamber. And I want this report read into the record before anyone is permitted to speak." The full session did not go the way anyone who'd sat through a council debate in the last 50 years expected it to. There was no grand opening statement because there was no human delegate present to receive one. There was, instead, Core, standing at the center of the chamber with the 30-page report in her hand, reading portions of it aloud to a room of representatives from 4,000 systems who had spent their careers assuming that Earth's steady, reliable presence in every crisis was simply the natural order of things. The way weather is the natural order of things, not a resource that could be exhausted, not a patience that could run out. The karate delegate, not the cruiser captain, but the actual seated representative, a broad, blunt-spoken elder named Tharn Vesic, stood up halfway through and said what a fair number of species in the room were thinking, and none of them wanted to be the one to say first. "So we asked them back," he said. "We apologize, we fix the vote, we backdate the trade routes, we pay what we owe. Problem solved. Why is this taking a full session?" "Because," Kate said, rising to answer him. And there was something in the HFY jurist's voice that hadn't been there in the working group. Not quite humility, but its close cousin. "We don't know if there's anyone left to apologize to." The chamber went very quiet. "I mean that literally," Kate continued. "Every attempt at contact has gone unanswered. Not refused. Unanswered. There is a difference, and it is the difference that should concern us. A refusal means they're still in the conversation, even if the conversation is no. Silence means we no longer know if we're a conversation they're still willing to have." Vesic sat back down slowly, and for once in his long and famously loud career, said nothing at all. It was Kathrani, unexpectedly, who was asked to speak next, and he stood with his forearms still faintly permanently, it seemed, tinted with something between apprehension and grief, and said the thing he'd been sitting on since the Onderhigh Ade's story about her grandmother's sister. "I don't think this is a negotiating tactic," he said. "I've spent 19 years working alongside these people, and if there's one thing I've learned about them, it's that when they want something from you, they ask for it directly, sometimes uncomfortably so. They don't play games with silence. This isn't strategy." He paused, choosing the next words carefully, aware that what he was about to say was not something the council had a formal category for. "I think we broke something, and I think the reason nobody's answering isn't that they're waiting for a better offer. I think if that trust, once it's gone past a certain point, isn't a thing you can offer your way back into. You have to become, over time, the kind of partner who wouldn't have broken it in the first place. And I don't know if this chamber is prepared to hear how long that actually takes." Nobody applauded, because council protocol didn't permit applause, but Kathrani noticed, sitting back down, that his color had shifted very slightly, not to the calm dove gray of routine business, and not to the anxious ochre of the last 2 weeks, but to something in between, a color he'd only ever seen on himself once before, at his own father's funeral, that Salu called simply the weight. It was the Onderhigh aide from the working group, seated now in the gallery rather than at the table, who was granted the floor next, an irregularity core allowed without explanation, though everyone in the chamber understood well enough what had prompted it. She stood, visibly unused to being looked at by 4,000 systems worth of representatives at once, and spoke without notes. "I told story about my grandmother's sister," she said, "because it was the only thing I had that felt true, and I want to say one more part of it now, because I think it matters more than the first part did. My grandmother spent the rest of her life trying to win her sister back. She wrote letters. She sent gifts. She showed up twice at her door and was turned away both times politely, which she said was worse than anger would have been." The aide paused, and the chamber, for once, did not rush her. She never won her back, not because her sister was cruel, and not because the wrong she'd done was unforgivable in the abstract. It was because winning someone back was never the right way to think about it in the first place. You don't win back a person who left because you stop seeing them. You become, slowly, over years, someone they'd have had no reason to leave. My grandmother spent her whole life trying to solve the wrong problem, and I don't want this council to make the same mistake. Whatever we send them, it can't be a better offer. It has to be evidence that we're already becoming something different, with or without their answer. Cade, who had begun the session insisting that sentiment was not a diplomatic category, was the one who moved that her remarks be entered into the formal record alongside the 30-page report, and the motion passed without a single dissent, the first unanimous vote in that chamber. Several delegates would later note, in longer than anyone present could actually remember. The vote to formally petition Earth for re-engagement passed with only the Karate delegation abstaining, on the grounds, stated with what for Vesic counted as genuine embarrassment, that they'd rather not be the ones drafting an apology to a species whose traffic control had turned their cruiser into a very slow, very public lesson in manners. The petition itself took 11 days to draft, because for the first time in council memory, every clause had to survive a question nobody had thought to ask before. Not, is this good for the council, but would this have been good enough if we'd offered it before any of this happened? Full voting membership, unconditional, backdated in formal record to the date of the 6th rejected application. A compensation framework for humanitarian and mediation work, negotiated rate, retroactive to cover the last decade at current market value, which the council's own Treasury office quietly noted was going to be a genuinely enormous sum, and which nobody on the drafting committee suggested reducing. All 17 trade route applications approved without further review, effective immediately. And at Kathrani's insistence, over Cade's initial and very several objection that it wasn't a standard diplomatic instrument, a single unstructured paragraph at the end, written not in council legal language, but in plain words, apologizing, not for a specific error, because they still weren't entirely sure which specific error had been the final one, but for the pattern the 30-page report had made undeniable. The petition went out on the 18th day. The response came back 4 hours later, which after 18 days of silence felt less like a reply and more like a held breath finally released. It was not from Ambassador Reyes. It was, Kathrani noted, from a name none of them recognized, a junior human envoy named Eris Okafor, whose file in the council archive was thin, unremarkable, the kind of record that belonged to someone who'd spent a career doing careful, competent, unglamorous work far from any spotlight. The message was short. We read it. All of it. Give us time. We're not answering for one person's hurt feelings. We're answering for a decision 300 million people had a hand in making. And that takes longer than 4 hours even for us. In the meantime, ask yourself this. If we hadn't stopped, would you ever have noticed? What the council could not see, in the 6 weeks that followed, was the argument happening on the other side of the silence, because Earth's decision to leave had never been made by a single office, and its decision about whether to return would not be made that way either. Eris Okafor's message had not been a diplomatic flourish. 300 million people really had, in one form or another, weighed in. It had started as a leaked internal memo from the Terran Diplomatic Corps, a blunt accounting of 2 centuries of unpaid mediation and quietly rejected trade routes, not unlike the one the Council's own archive division would later assemble. Except this one had been compiled a full year earlier by a mid-level analyst. Nobody had asked to write it. It should have stayed a footnote. Instead, it had reached a journalist, then a public broadcast, then a continent-wide debate that spread faster than any government press office could shape it. And by the time Ambassador Reyes sat down to draft the 11 words that ended 2 centuries of diplomacy, she was not making a unilateral choice. She was ratifying one that a global referendum, run in a scramble over 11 frantic days, had already made for her by a margin nobody had expected. 71% in favor of full suspension, pending review. The 6 weeks of silence that followed were not, as half the council quietly assumed, a performance of resolve. They were an argument, public, messy, conducted in town halls and call-in broadcasts and endless committee hearings not so different from the council's own, except run by people who had never worn a diplomatic title in their lives. Farmers who'd never left their home continent argued with veterans of 3 separate off-world peacekeeping tours about whether walking away from 61 active conflicts was principled or simply cruel to the people caught in the middle of them, people who hadn't asked to be bargaining chips in a dispute about respect. A retired mediator, one of the first generation to work council conflicts back when Earth had barely finished unifying its own governments, stood up at a public hearing and said the thing that ended up, more than any single official statement, shaping what came next. "We're not owed anything for wanting to help," she said, into a microphone that carried her voice to every screen on the planet. "That's the whole point of showing up. But we are owed the truth about what our help was worth to the people asking for it. And for 200 years, nobody ever told us. They just let us assume it wasn't much, and we let them, because it was easier than asking." She paused, and the silence in that hearing room broadcast a light year and more from anyone in the council chamber who would eventually hear about it secondhand. Was its own kind of statement. "I don't think we should go back because they're finally offering to pay us. I think we should go back because they finally told us the truth in public where it cost them something to say it. That's worth more than the money. But it should come with the money too." Priya Nakamura, recalled from AAL Kest in the same 40-second window as everyone else, and among the loudest voices in the 6 weeks of argument that followed, because she was the one person on the planet who could describe exactly what unpaid mediation looked like from the inside of a room where 2 clans were deciding whether to go back to killing each other, testified twice. The second time, she brought a photograph of the water-sharing agreement she'd built, signed in 3 different scripts by elders who'd buried children in the wars that ended, and set it on the table in front of the committee without saying anything at all for almost a full minute. "I'd do it again," she finally said. "I'd do it again tomorrow for free, if that's what it took." That's not the argument. The argument is whether anyone should have to choose between doing the work they believe in and being treated like their work matters. I don't think those should ever have been 2 different questions. For a long time, out there they were. By the time the council's petition arrived on the 18th day, the vote to accept it, conditional on the terms actually holding, conditional on the council proving, over time and not just on paper, that the pattern in that 30-page report was truly finished, had already been building toward a majority for nearly a week. The 6 weeks of silence that followed weren't hesitation. They were the time it took to write a response that 300 million people, and not just one ambassador, could stand behind? The answer, when it finally came 6 weeks later, arrived the same way the withdrawal had, simultaneously, to every council office, exactly on schedule, as though someone on Earth had a very precise sense of when 6 weeks would feel like patience and not indifference. Ambassador Reyes herself delivered it, appearing on every screen at once, sitting at the same desk in the same office that had sat dark and untouched for 6 weeks. Her tea presumably long since gone cold and replaced a dozen times over. "We're coming back," she said, without preamble, because Kathrani realized, watching, that preamble had never really been her style. She'd always started with the thing that mattered and let the rest follow. Not because the petition was generous, though it was. Not because we missed the meetings, though some of us did, more than we expected to. We're coming back because you did the hardest thing a system that size can do, which is look honestly at how it had been treating someone it depended on and change, in public, without being forced to, at gunpoint. That matters more to us than any clause in that document. She paused, and for a moment looked less like a diplomat delivering a statement and more like a woman who had genuinely not been sure, until she said the words aloud, whether she believed them herself. "But we're not coming back the same," she continued. "We're not going to be the species you call when the ugly, unglamorous work needs doing and nobody wants to be seen doing it. We're not going to be the free labor holding your supply chains together while you debate our membership for the 7th time. If we're in this council, we're in it as a member, with a vote and a voice and the right to say no when saying no is the honest answer. That's not a threat. That's the actual unglamorous, boring truth about what a real partnership costs. And I hope, that after 6 weeks of finding out what it cost to lose one, you're finally ready to pay it." She reached forward, and for a moment the feed showed her hand resting on the edge of the same framed photograph the Vantris Trade Annex camera had caught her carrying out the door 6 weeks earlier. A photograph, Kathrani could now see clearly for the first time, of a young girl on a swing, laughing mid-motion, caught at the exact instant before gravity pulled her back down. "We'll see you at the next session," Reyes said, and the feed ended. The chamber, when the human delegation walked back in 11 days later, was fuller than it had been in a decade. Every seat occupied, every screen live, for 1,000 systems worth of representatives who had spent 6 weeks discovering, in ways large and small, exactly how much weight one quiet, reliable species had been carrying without anyone bothering to ask. Reyes took her seat at the head of a small, familiar delegation, and Kathrani noticed, sitting 2 rows back, that she looked older than she had before the silence. Not tired exactly, but settled in some way that hadn't been there before, the way a bridge looks different once it's actually been tested and found, against all worry, to hold. Kor opened the session not with an agenda, which was itself unprecedented, but with a simple question directed at the human ambassador, asked in the plain, unstructured language that the last 6 weeks had taught the entire council to finally, belatedly value. "What do you need from us?" Kor said, "that we haven't already put on paper?" Reyes considered the question for a long moment, and the whole chamber, for 1,000 systems, every species that had ever asked humanity for help and every species that had never quite managed to say thank you for receiving it, waited to hear what you would say. "Just remember this feeling," Reyes said finally. "Not the panic. The part after, where you actually looked. Don't wait until the room goes quiet again to notice who's been holding it up." Nobody in the chamber applauded, because council protocol still didn't permit it, but Kathrani watched his own forearm settle, for the first time in 8 weeks, into a color he hadn't seen on himself in years. Not the anxious ochre of crisis, not the heavy gray of grief, but something lighter, something he hadn't had cause to feel about the council's work in a very long time. He would have called it, if Tsalu had a word for it, relief. But watching Reyes take her seat, watching the human delegation settle back into a chamber that had finally, expensively learned to see them, he thought there might be a better word for it, one he'd have to ask Ambassador Okafor about, next time they spoke. Hope, maybe, or something closer to trust, rebuilt not with an apology, but with the slow, unglamorous, ongoing work of actually paying attention. The council, for the first time he could remember, adjourned the session early, not because the business was finished, but because, for once, nobody in the room felt any need to prove they'd been the last one talking. Kathrani went to A.L. Kest himself, for months later, though nothing in his post required it, and Cade told him, not unkindly, that he was being sentimental about a moon he'd never once visited in 19 years of service. He went anyway, because the compensation framework had cleared its first full disbursement cycle that month, and because he'd read, buried in a routine regional update nobody else had flagged, that Priya Nakamura had gone back. He found her exactly where the old bulletins had placed the water-sharing talks 9 years earlier, at a long table on a windswept ridge that no longer had equipment staged along its edge, sitting across from a Dusk Hollow elder and a Faroe negotiator who were, as far as Kathrani could tell from a respectful distance, arguing about irrigation schedules with the particular, unhurried patience of people who had already survived the version of this argument that ended in bodies. Basak was there too, at Nakamura's elbow, taking notes, no longer the anxious junior officer who'd walked out of a 40-minute meeting 9 weeks into the crisis without understanding what he'd broken. He looked, now, like someone being taught a trade by a master who had decided he was worth teaching properly. Nakamura didn't stop the meeting when she saw Kathrani approaching. She simply raised 2 fingers without looking up, the universal sign, apparently, for wait, and it was another 20 minutes before she rose, shook hands with both delegations in a gesture Kathrani gathered was significant by the way both sides mirrored it back with unusual care, and walked over to where he stood. "Ambassador Kathrani," she said. "I read your name in the session transcripts. You were the one who argued for the apology paragraph." "I was," he said. "I wasn't sure it would matter, next to the money and the vote." It mattered. She looked back at the table, where the 2 delegations were still talking, no council officer standing over them with a briefing packet, no artificial urgency pushing the conversation faster than it wanted to go. "The money bought us back. The apology is the reason some of us decided to stay bought." She said it without bitterness. In the same plain, unhurried register the woman with the chipped coffee mug had used, months earlier and a continent away, and Kathrani understood, watching her, that it was not a coincidence, that this was simply how humans sounded when they had decided to say something true and didn't feel any need to dress it up. "Is it holding?" he asked, nodding toward the ridge. "The agreement. It's holding because it's being paid for now, and because somebody finally admitted the last one only survived on my goodwill, which was never a sustainable foundation for anything, no matter how many years it happened to work." She glanced at Basak, still bent over his notes. "And because I'm not doing it alone anymore. That's the part your council report never had a column for. It wasn't just that we weren't paid enough. It's that we were never backed up. One mediator, one moon, no relief, no understudy, no institutional memory if something happened to her. You build a galaxy that depended on individual humans not getting tired, not getting sick, not wanting a life outside the job. That was never going to hold forever. It just held long enough that nobody had to find out." Kathrani thought of his own forearms, the color he'd worn for 8 straight weeks, that Salo didn't have a clean word for, and said the only honest thing he had. "I don't think any of us understood what we were spending until we saw what it cost to run out." "Most people don't," Nakamura said, and for the first time since he'd walked up, she smiled, small and real. "The trick isn't understanding it before you run out. Nobody does that. The trick is what you do once you finally see the bill." She looked past him, toward the ridge, toward the 2 delegations still talking in the fading light, toward a war that had come within days of restarting and had instead, against every precedent in A.L. Kest's long and bloody history, been talked back down. "So, are you staying for dinner? The Dusk Hollow elder makes something with the ridge grain that I promise you have never had anywhere else in the council, and I'd like it on record that at least one ambassador came out here for a reason that wasn't a crisis." Kathrani found, somewhat to his own surprise, that his arms had settled into the calm, unremarkable dove gray he hadn't worn without effort in nearly a year, and that he was, for what felt like the first time in a very long while, in no hurry at all to leave. "Yendi,"